Hi, and thank you for taking the time to check out our talk. My name is Iris, and the work I'm presenting here is done in collaboration with Anton Karl Ingarsson and Joel Wallenberg. So what we will be talking about is grammatically conditioned intra-speaker variation in Icelandic case marking, so-called dative substitution or dative sickness. I'll go into the details of the variable in just a minute, but here are our main questions. So what happens when children have the kind of variation I just described in their linguistic environment? Do they regularize it away or probability match? Or is there maybe a third option where they neither regularize nor match the parental rate of the variant, but replicate systematic contrasts instead? So what we'll do is analyze the responses of children and their caregivers on different tasks to investigate the association within child-caregiver pairs across and within conditions, as well as documenting grammatical conditioning factors at the group level. And we're lucky enough to have a relatively short but very rich tradition for this kind of developmental social linguistics research, which we will try to engage with. The general objectives for the talk are the following. I've already talked about investigating how children acquire grammatically conditioned case marking variation in function of caregiver language within and across conditions. This is also the first time someone is documenting variation in Icelandic child caretaker diets. And we're additionally using the opportunity to confirm empirically the presence of grammatical conditioning factors for children and adults showing dative substitution. And finally, you'll see that our methodology contrasts with the more traditional corpus-based approach, as well as the artificial language experiments literature. And so one of our goals is to evaluate judgments and forced choice as a proxy for usage in developmental social linguistic studies targeting low-frequency variables. Right, now for some background. So Icelandic subject case variation is one of the most researched topics of morphosyntactic change in Insular Scandinavian, which is just a fancy way of saying Icelandic and Faroese. We'll be talking about the most common form in Icelandic in this talk, dative substitution, which is also known as dative sickness in the prescriptivist discourse. Dative substitution is a relatively stable but stigmatized variant, which seems to have spread at the end of the 19th century, even though we have examples of variation in Old Icelandic. Dative substitution consists of dative being used instead of the original subject case for a number of different psych verbs, most of them traditionally appearing with accusative subjects. So dative is more common than accusative in subject case, but both are marked in contrast with the structural nominative. You can see an example of dative substitution here on the slide, with hana langar í epli becoming henni langar í epli. So the first version has the accusative form of the third person singular feminine pronoun, and the second has the dative. It's kind of like two different versions of her in English, so in contrast with she, which would be hún in Icelandic. Dative substitution has been fairly well documented in a number of studies, some of them very extensive, and shows widespread grammatically conditioned intra-speaker variation. So it's useful to analyze dative substitution in the context of the dynamics of variation in individuals and specialization. And in the present talk, we focus on two types of grammatical or language internal categorical conditioning factors, which should result in specialization. But of course, it's clear that there's also socio-stylistic conditioning at play along a continuous dimension. So how those different dimensions of conditioning interact is definitely an interesting topic for another study. Here we focus on the well-known person-specific retention, which consists in dative being selected more often when the subject is in the third person as compared to the first, and there might be a number effect as well. This has often been attributed to prescriptivism and self-correction, but intra-speaker variation, which is conditioned in this particular way, can be found in informal context and child language. And then we look at a possible syncretism effect, which has not been confirmed until now. So we thought that dative might be selected more often when the nominative and accusative are syncretic, so like with stelpunar, the girls here on this slide. with the same form in the nominative and accusative. And in contrast, strákarnir, the boys, has 3 different forms for the nominative, accusative, and dative. So we think this syncretism effect might be due to some kind of preference for contrast saliency when the input is variable, because the nominative accusative syncretism entails a less clear signal for an experimental oblique subject construction. So, what do we expect learners to do when they encounter this kind of variation? Do they learn the conditioning or just go categorical? Or do they match their parents' variant use rate? So we have, fortunately, we have some clues from previous research. First, we know that the relationship between input frequencies and acquisition is complex, but of course, some correspondence between variant rate in children and their caregivers is still expected. So children usually do learn their parents' dialect. But previous studies have shown that there's more to it than that. The work by Smith and colleagues, for example, has led to light that correlations between variant rate and child caregiver diets may depend on age, the variable type, or maybe language domain even, and social saliency. So, for example, Smith, Durham, and Fortune found a significant relationship for the house whose variable in Scots, so the parents' rate explained the children's rate, but not for third-person plural s and TD deletion. Crucially, group contrast were still replicated for those variables. So we also have things to draw from the artificial language experiment literature, where it has been shown that adults probability match inconsistent input while children regularize it. But conditioning changes the whole picture, with at least older children acquiring contrast but still not matching the input. And then we know from research in cross-linguistic and multilingual contexts that amount and consistency of data might matter as well, which might be related to the conditioning complexity idea. So what about children acquiring dative substitution? So let's look at what we did to find out. The data we're working with for this talk were not collected specifically to answer the questions we have outlined so far. We have data from the Molikotilako project in Iceland, or modeling the linguistic consequences of language contact, where the aim was to map the presence of English in the Icelandic language community and evaluate its possible effect on the development of Icelandic in a broad sense. So our participants originally participated in an online survey and subsequently in testing sessions at the University of Iceland. And you can see the age distribution here. We have data from 101 child and 95 caregivers, and we're able to connect them into 84 valid child caregiver dyads. And we used classic or traditional judgments and forced choice for the parents, but the children only had forced choice atoms. So we're using these methods as a proxy for usage, transforming the judgments into binomial variables. And we are, of course, very aware of the limitations involved. But this is a low-frequency variable, and really not the perfect candidate for corpus-based research, although it should definitely be done, even though we kind of lack the corpora here in Iceland. We also think it's interesting methodologically to see how far we can get using these types of methods paired with a relatively lower number of items, as you can see. So in the Molikotilako project, we tested a wide array of variables and were not able to test each one extensively. So we have 7 and 13 items respectively for the children and adults to compute the rate of usage, and then only 2 and 4 for each conditioning factor. I'll show you a couple of test sentence examples in the next slide, but we used non-syncretic personal pronouns to test the person-specific retention, and third-person plural full NPs to test the syncretism effect. So here you have some examples. the judgments we have the original accusative form, strákana, in this particular example, which was rated by the caregivers, and then the children heard all the different options actually. So either 2 or 3 forms, excluding the genitive, and chose between them. So the kids were asked what they would say themselves, which is a method we've used in a couple of studies already and works surprisingly well. Okay, so let's look at the results. I will start with the rate of original case use and the correspondence between the children and their caregivers. So here we can see if the caregivers with the highest rate of original case are associated with the children who select the original case the most. So we have the data from the kids here in blue on the left and the caregivers in yellow. And you can see by the lines linking them together that there is not a strong relationship at all. In fact, it's not even significant. If there were a strong correlation, we would expect the lines to be much cleaner and mainly going in one direction, and not all this overlap you can see on the graph. So the children don't seem to match their parents' rate as measured by our proxy. It's also interesting that this picture doesn't really change across age. Even though we see the data stretching up as the kids get older, there isn't a significant age effect. And additionally, we don't see the trend observed in the literature where younger children tend to be more categorical or regularize more, but we also had older participants in our study in general. We have 7 categorical children with no original case use, and they're spread across all age groups, and 15 categorical caregivers with original case use throughout. And the answers of those of the categorical caregivers were not associated with children who were different from the rest of the group. So the picture doesn't change very much with age, as you can see. We always have the higher rate of original case in the parents, which is consistent with previous data substitution research, and the lack of correspondence in the dyads. Okay, now let's look at the conditioning factors. So starting with the person-specific retention at group level, you see straight away that we have a similar pattern emerging in the caregivers and children. So more dative substitution with a third-person singular pronoun as compared to the first person, and the effect is slightly bigger for the parents and the rate overall lower, as you would expect when documenting ongoing change. But remember that the methods differed between the groups and that the caregivers also had more items here, so 4 as opposed to 2. And what's interesting, if we look at the age pattern here on the next slide, is that there isn't really an age pattern. We find the effect across age groups, even though the oldest kids are most similar to the adults. But we're probably underpowered for more subtle age trends here. Now, continuing to the syncretism results, we have a similar picture emerging. Effect present in both groups, so the dative substitution rate or accusative rejection for the parents goes up when we have subjects showing nominative accusative syncretism. And we see that the effect size difference here as compared to the person-specific retention is bigger. So with the difference between conditions being smaller for the children, there's less of a difference. Age was not significant here either, but if we visualize the data like this, you can see that the effect is only present in the older age groups, even though we didn't get a significant age syncretism interaction. This could also be due to the study being underpowered for age effects within conditions, as will maybe become a bit more apparent when we look at the grammatical conditioning at the individual level and ask about the correspondence between children and caregivers within conditions, which we think is an important step to take if we want to understand the intergenerational transmission mechanism better. So you see that within conditions, children didn't really have a lot of room for variation or mismatches. There's only 2 items per condition. So we have a third of the participants showing variation in the syncretism condition and half in the person-specific retention one. But we probably have participants who look categorical or consistent here, but maybe wouldn't be if we give them more opportunities or items for variation. All right, so out of the 33 children showing variation in the syncretism effect condition, 73% show the expected pattern where syncretism is associated with dative. And again, out of the 33, 16 had caregivers who also showed variation in their answers. 11 of those 16 pairs had matching patterns. The picture is really similar for the person-specific retention, although there's more variation in general, and there's 85% of the kids showing variation who follow the expected pattern. We had 19 child caregiver pairs to check out for this condition, and 13 of them were matching. So you can see that when the child doesn't match the caregiver, it's the caregiver who shows the expected effect and not the other way around generally. And we think it's really important to look at the replication of patterns at the group or and individual or maybe pair level. So you can see here that even though we didn't find a general caregiver-child correlation in the usage rate, we do find pattern replication not only at the group level but also within the pairs. Okay, now to sum everything up and discuss the results a bit further. Theoretically, we have shown that when acquiring grammatically conditioned case marking variation, children neither regularize nor match their parents' variant rate. Instead, we find systematic contrast replication at the group and individual level. So this is in line with previous work in developmental social linguistics, or at least in line with previous results for some variables and some age groups. Empirically, we've shown that children acquiring non-nominative subjects in Icelandic show dative substitution and acquire the grammatical conditioning present in their caregiver's language, namely the person-specific retention and syncretism effect. So dative substitution shows robust I conditioning along a categorical dimension, with S conditioning also present and supposedly acquired in specific contexts. And maybe that points toward stable variation within specialized variants. And finally, we think the correspondence with previous work suggests that judgments and forced choice can be used as a proxy for usage in developmental social linguistic studies when targeting low-frequency variables, and particularly if adequately powered. So, thank you. We're very grateful to the participants for making this research possible.